There's something to be said for being first. But after the initial excitement wears off, what was once novel finds itself forgotten in favor of the latest model, only to be rediscovered years later. While this wasn't the first X-mount camera, it was the first in the series, a series that produced my current favorite camera. But more on that later. This is the X-E1, and it is a slow camera. As far as I can tell, there is no other video on YouTube that has every X-E camera from Fujifilm in hand. The X-E1, the X-E2, the X-E3, and the X-E4. Now I've shot with all of them, and I'm going to let you know which one is probably best for you. I sought out the X-E1 because I was looking for a camera somewhere between my X100V and X-T4. I love both of those cameras, but I wanted the flexibility of an interchangeable lens camera and something smaller than my X-T4. The X100V is a great camera, but the fixed 35mm equivalent lens in my hands is jack of all trades, master of none. I generally prefer longer focal lengths between 50 and 85mm. Now for that purpose, you can buy Fujifilm's teleconverter that's compatible with all X100 series cameras. This gives you a 50mm equivalent with the same f2 maximum aperture, but it's not without compromise. First, it adds quite a bit of bulk to a camera that's meant to tag along with you without being noticed by you or your subjects. And second, it's expensive. At $349 new or $250 used, it costs as much or more than many older interchangeable lens Fujifilm models used. So if you already own a few lenses, something like the X-E series starts to make a lot of sense. You can throw a small lens at the focal length of your choosing for something smaller than an X100 with a teleconverter, and at roughly the same price. So why the X-E1? Fujifilm has put out quite a few cameras, and since it's natively an APS-C mount, many of them are quite compact. Outside of the largest digital cameras, the flagship XT and X Pro series, there's the XA, XE, XM, XS, XT3 digit, and XE2 digit cameras. So again, why the X-E1? First, I wanted a viewfinder. Some of the most inexpensive and compact Fujifilm bodies like the XM1 and XA1 don't have a viewfinder. I wanted something that cost less than a teleconverter. I got my copy of the X-E1 on eBay for $250 in mint condition. And while pretty much any camera of the last 15 years can take fantastic photos, there's a lot of people out there that favor the X-Trans 1 sensor, saying it has a certain amount of magic. Of course, I had to see what that was all about. Okay, so let's cover the good first with the X-E1. The 16 megapixel first generation X-Trans sensor does have great colors and a really pleasing grain when you push the ISO a little bit. It sports a 2.4 million dot OLED viewfinder that I really enjoyed shooting with. Build quality is great. The camera's made in Japan and consists mostly of metal, and overall it just feels great in the hands. I added a thumb grip, but I wouldn't say it's strictly necessary. This camera and the X-E2 both have a built-in flash also, and one little trick I really like is that you can bounce it off of the ceiling. To summarize the rest of this camera though, frustrating. It has contrast detect only autofocus, which can be painfully slow even in moderately low light. Shot-to-shot times are slow. I shoot in RAW only on this camera because of it, whereas with most other Fujis I would shoot with RAW and JPEG, opting to keep the JPEG only most times. Dynamic range is pretty bad. The camera does reward you when you expose a shot properly, but don't expect to work too much magic on the raw or take shots in really challenging conditions. And my biggest complaint is with the controls on this camera, mainly the command dial, which is completely useless. You can really only use it for image review or punching in with a click during manual focus. I really would love to be able to map it to shutter speed, ISO, or exposure compensation, but it's just not possible. Adjusting the shutter speed between stops has to be done with the 4-way pad on the back. And the T setting on the shutter speed dial only allows you to set longer shutter speeds rather than move through the whole range like later Fuji cameras. Speaking of shutter speed, if you set an intermediate shutter speed, the camera will forget all about it when you turn it off and back on. Finally, the exposure compensation dial is easily bumped, so auto ISO is pretty much a no-go for me. Of all those things, I would say the biggest showstopper is the autofocus. But using manual lenses, that's not really a problem, is it? I threw a Voigtlander 21mm f4 on there and used the excellent focusing scales to focus starting at the hyperfocal distance. Pre-focusing with zone focusing is faster than any autofocus, and it suits this camera well. Before we look at the rest of the cameras in the series, let's briefly talk about what they all have in common. They each have their generation's X-Trans APS-C sensor, the same one found in the flagship cameras. They all have a viewfinder. They all have the X mount and are compatible with every Fujifilm lens ever made. They all have Fujifilm's well-loved film simulations, later models with more simulations of course, and they can all shoot RAW if you choose. None of the cameras to date have IBIS or weather sealing. All 4 cameras weigh basically the same, around 375 grams or 13 ounces. They all use the same battery, and all take SD cards. Now that we know what they all have in common, let's go through the rest of the cameras one by one. And at the end of the video, we'll talk about which camera makes sense for you and your budget. Just a reminder that all of these cameras can produce excellent photos, so it's really going to be about ergonomics in the shooting experience and the advances and changes they have made in that area with each new model. This is the X-E2, and while it may look identical to the X-E1, it's not. The screen has twice the resolution. The autofocus? The second generation X-Trans processor? Fast. Jokes aside, this camera is better in every way than the X-E1. It came out less than a year later and sports an identical build still made in Japan. Resolution remains at 16 megapixels, but the second generation X-Trans sensor now has phase detect autofocus. Shot-to-shot times are also much faster, and dynamic range is a lot better. You get an electronic shutter that goes up to 1/32,000th of a second, rather than being limited to the 1/4000th of a second mechanical shutter of the X-E1. And the command dial is actually useful this time. You can set the top dial to T and quickly move through the whole range of shutter speeds, and the camera won't forget your set shutter speed when turning off and back on. The exposure compensation dial is also more difficult to move in a good way. There's practically no reason to go for the X-E1 when this camera exists. And note there's also the X-E2S, but for almost all purposes it's exactly the same. It's just a minor facelift with a few software tweaks. Most of the features of the X-E2S actually came to this camera via a firmware update late in its life. I got some great photos from this camera, which I got for $287 in bargain condition from KEH. Does this camera look minimalist to you? I don't see it either, but that's how Fujifilm marketed it in 2017 upon its release. While they did remove the built-in flash and the 4-way pad on the back, they added a host of other features. basically redesigning this camera from the ground up. Instead of a single dial on the back, you get a front and a rear dial, both clickable. The exposure compensation dial gains a C setting to boot, allowing you to adjust the exposure compensation via the front dial. There's an AF joystick that makes moving your focus point a breeze, and the screen is now a touch screen. You can touch to move the focus point, take a shot, swipe and zoom during image review, and more. You get in-body USB charging through the micro USB port. The menu system has been updated and is a lot more intuitive. The third generation X-Trans sensor is bumped up from 16 megapixels to 24, and you get significantly more phase detected area on the sensor as compared to the X-E2. Everything is faster. Shot-to-shot times, autofocus, you name it. You even get face and eye detection, though it's not all that reliable. In my opinion, this camera somehow missed the mark. There's a lot going on, yet somehow it's the lightest camera in the series. To me, it actually feels kind of hollow. It's also no longer made in Japan, not that that matters. I bought it in silver, which doesn't quite feel like metal and cheapens the camera further. I have a silver X100V, which would eat this thing for lunch in terms of build quality. There's a reason the X100 series is more expensive, and it's not just the hybrid viewfinder. This is probably the camera you should get though if you want the most value for the series. You can get it for about $500 used, and the touchscreen, improved autofocus, and modern menus are worth it if this is going to be one of your main cameras. This is the X-E4, my favorite camera of all time. People love to hate this camera because when compared to the X-E3, they removed the grip, removed the rear dial, and removed the focus switch. But none of that matters, and let's talk about why. Fujifilm is all about ergonomics. With the X-E4, you have the exposure triangle at hand. You have the aperture ring on the lens, the shutter speed dial, and you can map your ISO to the front dial. Usually, I'll set the shutter speed dial to T so I can control it from the front dial. I'll set my aperture on the lens, of course, and then I will use the marked values on the exposure compensation dial in combination with auto ISO. Again, that's a very fast and flexible setup, and one that really fits the size of this body well. The X-E3 felt kind of overloaded, but I think they really nailed it with this camera. Let's talk about the build. This is the heaviest camera in the series, but only by 15 grams. It's also the smallest camera of the series, so it feels really solid and dense. By far, it's the best build of the series with a metal top and bottom plate. It's still not quite on the level of the X100V, but it's getting close, and still a lot cheaper and more flexible. You get a USB-C port up from micro USB, which is always nice. And the grip. They did remove the built-in contoured grip, which I thought was excellent on the other cameras. In my opinion, you do need to add some additional grip to this camera because of it. Either a thumb grip, I have the LensMate version, or a hand grip, preferably Fujifilm's MHG metal hand grip. I actually like the flexible nature of this camera, being able to choose minimal grip and size with a small lens like the 27mm Pancake, or a chunkier grip for a larger lens like the 56mm f1.2. They added a tilt screen for waist level or even selfie shooting. And for someone who shoots their kid and their dog a lot, being able to shoot at waist level is invaluable. The 26 megapixel X-Trans 4 sensor is Fujifilm's best. You get full sensor coverage for phase detect autofocus, and the autofocus is fast. Face and eye detect autofocus, while not industry leading, does work well in this camera, much better than the X-E3. Colors, detail, it is all fantastic, and again in such a tiny package, smaller than a lot of micro 4/3 cameras. The X-E3 was a fast camera, but this camera is just instant, for lack of a better word. Minor things like slightly reduced shutter lag, not that there was a lot on the X-E3, but little details like that just get out of your way and make photography flow. I generally keep the 35mm f2 on the camera, but you put the hand grip and the 56mm f1.2 on and you have a portrait powerhouse. The only downside to this camera is availability in current conditions. You won't even get a discount on the used market of more than $20 or $30. Alright, let's talk final recommendations. At current used prices of around $325, the X-E1 just doesn't make sense when the X-E2 is out there for similar price. So only if you really just want the cheapest possible option should you go with the X-E1. If you still plan to shoot the camera a lot, I would definitely go with the X-E2 for the improved autofocus and controls. The X-E3 offers a ton of features at a great value. Finally, my favorite camera, the X-E4, is pretty much out of stock everywhere. So if you want it, you might have to wait for it, and you better be willing to pay for it. I hope you figured out which camera might make sense for you. See you next time.